Chapter 8 Surrounded 2000 Other Wes's Point of View. The phone had been ringing continuously for 3 minutes. Mary sat on her sofa, unflinching. She was in no mood to talk, no mood to explain, no mood for consolation. She simply leaned forward, with her elbows resting on her knees, watching the television screen flickering just 5 feet in front of her. Her hands trembled. 10 minutes ago, a news report had stopped her cold. Mary didn't watch much television. She felt she never had time, but she just happened to have it on this evening. She saw file footage of a jewelry store she didn't recognize, its red brick exterior surrounded by police and yellow tape, accompanied by the newscaster's somber narration of events. Mary had been so busy that she was completely unaware this story had gripped the city for days. But as she sat on the sofa, she got caught up on what she had missed. 3 days earlier, in broad daylight, 2 masked men had run into J. Brown's jewelers, waving guns at the customers, ordering them to the ground. Customers screamed in fear and quickly followed the orders as 2 more masked men entered. These men carried mallets in their gloved hands. The gunmen scanned the room, their weapons trained on the terrified customers and employees, their heads swiveling, looking for any movement. They barked out orders over the screams of their victims. Following the robbers' command, the workers and customers pressed their faces to the ground. "Keep your hands on the backs of your heads! I ain't playing with you!" yelled one of the armed robbers. "What do you have in your hands?" Another gunman yelled to a woman who had been talking on her cell phone when the 4 men ran into the store. With her arms outstretched and her torso resting on the ground, she slowly closed her phone, keeping her hands in open sight. The 2 men with mallets were oblivious to the pandemonium around them. They headed straight to the display cases that housed the watches and necklaces. Their decisive movements showed they knew exactly where to go and what they were looking for. One of the people being held at gunpoint was Sergeant Bruce Prothero, a 35-year-old, 13-year veteran of the Baltimore County Police Department. Earlier that day, he left his wife and 5 children, ranging in age from 2 to 6, to work his second job as a security guard at the jewelers. After his wife had triplets, he needed to pick up an additional part-time job so she could stay home with the kids. He was supposed to be off that day, but was covering for a friend who needed the day off. He was known around the department as a man ferociously devoted to protecting his family and his colleagues. Sergeant Prothero was now being held by the neck, a gun pressed against the back of his head, his hands high in the air. He was unceremoniously forced to the floor with the others. After grabbing $438,000 worth of watches and jewels from the store, one of the robbers yelled, "Let's go!" and the 4 ran out to the adjacent parking lot where a 1984 Oldsmobile Delta 88 and a 1987 Mercury Grand Marquis waited for them. Both cars had been bought a week earlier at an auto auction. Most of the people in the store kept their eyes closed and heads on the ground. A few, including Sergeant Prothero, raised their heads to watch the men leave. Once the thieves cleared the door, these few quickly rose to their feet. Sergeant Prothero followed his instincts and ran out after the robbers. Drawing his weapon from his holster, he sprinted through the entrance. He looked around the parking lot for signs of the 4 men. He ducked behind cars, carefully peering through glass windows and above hoods. As Sergeant Prothero scampered behind the Delta 88 and began to lift his head, a black-gloved hand reached out the window holding a handgun and let off 3 shots, striking Prothero at point-blank range. Even after getting shot twice in the chest and once in the head, Sergeant Prothero stumbled off and ran about 10 feet, finally falling in the green bushes that surrounded the jewelry store. For the next minutes, he fought a losing battle for his life. The 2 getaway cars had long since screeched out of the parking lot. Crime in Baltimore and its suburbs had spiraled out of control, particularly in the city proper. Baltimore City was now averaging over 300 murders a year, making it one of the per capita deadliest cities in America. Police officers were consistently trying to solve gun crimes, drug-related crimes, domestic abuse crimes, and robberies. But this case was different, more personal to the cops assigned to it. Not only did it take place outside Baltimore City, in the county, an area where vicious murders were less common, but this shooting involved one of their own. All hands would be on deck to make sure that the perpetrators were brought to justice. The first major lead in the case came a day after the shooting. One of the suspects called a notorious drug dealer to offer him a chance to buy some stolen watches. The drug dealer had an authorized wiretap on his phone, and as a result, the police got a search warrant and went to the house where the call originated. When they found one of the stolen watches under a seat cushion, they suspected they had their man. He later confessed to being in on the robbery but denied that he had pulled the trigger. Through his interviews, the police identified the other 3 men, where they lived, and more details about the crime. A day later, another member of the crew was captured. He also confessed to being at the scene but said that he was not the one who pulled the trigger. In fact, he was later quoted as saying, "I was actually unarmed. I was just told I could make $50,000 to break some glass." This wasn't the first trip through the criminal justice system for either of them. Both men, in their early 20s, had long criminal records that included drug charges, handgun violations, and assault charges. One of them had been charged a year before with 2 counts of first-degree murder for separate shootings in West Baltimore. Mary was riveted as she listened to the reporter's dry voice. It was an audacious crime, a troubling sign of the violence that felt like it was closing in on her, no matter how far she moved away from the center of the city. Her phone started to ring. Again, she ignored it. Then the reporter described the final 2 suspects. The reporter warned those watching that they should be assumed to be armed and very dangerous. Mary's large screen television was now filled with photos of these suspects. Her heart broke when she saw Tony's and Wes's faces staring back at her. Midnight passed, and one day turned to the next. Mary could not sleep. She felt terrible about the death of the police officer. She prayed her sons were not responsible. As she lay in bed, she realized that, no matter what the outcome, all of their lives had changed forever. Mary knew it was just a matter of time before she would become the target of questioning. She had not spoken to Wes or Tony for days, but after hearing the news, she wanted to speak to them just as much as she was sure the police did. At 4 a.m., Mary heard a loud banging on her metal front door. "Police! Open this door!" She threw on a blue robe, yelling that she was on her way. She could tell from the increasingly frantic banging that the police were seconds away from coming in, with or without an invitation. She cracked open the door, her right eye peering out to see who was waiting. She looked past the stocky man in plain clothes and saw 10, maybe more, cops lined up behind. A few wore uniforms. More were wearing plain clothes. All were tense. Some had their weapons raised, some had them holstered, their hands ready to snap the guns loose at a moment's notice. Only a thin, hollow metal door stood between her and them. A plainclothesman in front of her flashed a badge, showed a search warrant, and brusquely asked Mary for permission to enter. She took a step back, and as soon as she did, the door swung open and the officers flooded into her home. With weapons drawn, teams split up and searched for Wes, Tony, or any evidence that they'd been there recently. One of the officers escorted Mary out of the house and sat her on the stairs outside. She hugged herself as the cold February air blew through her cotton bathrobe. Before long, an officer appeared before her and unleashed a barrage of sternly delivered questions. But Mary could only keep repeating the truth. She had no idea where the boys were and had not seen them in weeks. "Did you know that both of your sons are on probation?" "Yes, I did." "Tony is supposed to be on home detention for a drug conviction, and Wesley's still on probation for drug charges for a few years ago." "I know what they were on probation for, officer. If you knew where they were, would you tell us?" Mary finally snapped at them. "Look, I just found out that my sons are wanted for killing a police officer. If I find anything out, I will tell you, and I will cooperate however I can. But right now, I don't need to be questioned like I did something wrong." The questions and searching of the house continued for the next hour. The jarring percussion of drawers being opened and closed, dressers being shifted around, and beds being flipped over, rattled through the quiet night and shook Mary's nerves. Black, spit-shined police shoes with hard rubber soles cracked down on every inch of the hardwood floor. Mary sat on the outdoor concrete steps with the officer standing over her, the two mirroring each other's despair and frustration. The first rays of morning lit up the still deserted streets of Dundalk, Maryland, where Mary's new home was located, as the cops mounted up to leave her ransacked space. Every crevice had been inspected, every room had been searched, every secret presumably uncovered. The police departed with a threat. They would be back and would not leave her alone until they found Tony and Wes. To nobody's surprise, they were true to their word. The search for the Moores had just begun. 2 days after that first early morning visit, Mary's niece, Nicey's daughter, was moments from walking down the aisle for her wedding. As a recording of Here Comes the Bride played over the loudspeaker in the Northeast Baltimore church, the rear doors opened and the veiled bride began her slow procession toward the altar. She walked alone down the aisle as the well-wishers in the pews stood and smiled. Tony was supposed to walk arm in arm with his cousin and give her away. Her father had never been involved in her life. Her unescorted stroll down the aisle was a subtle reminder that the manhunt for two of Maryland's most wanted was still on, now in day 5. The family had been bombarded with interview requests, police questioning, and neighborhood stares. Both city and county police had been crisscrossing their jurisdictions looking for any sign of Wes and Tony. The police conducted a raid of the Circle Terrace apartments in Lansdowne, where Tony lived. Acting on a tip, they combed the North Point neighborhood in Baltimore. A team of officers went by Wes's current address on the 2700 block of Calvert Street in the city, on the outskirts of Johns Hopkins University, close enough that Wes could see and hear the construction slowly creeping in around him. The police plastered the neighborhood with wanted posters, advertising a sizable reward. In the evenings, a police chopper with searchlights flew over the Essex community, where Wes had lived a few years earlier. The wedding was a reprieve for the family. This celebration was the first time in days that they could simply enjoy one another's company without the events of February 7th dominating the conversation. Today was supposed to be about joy and love. Following the ceremony, the doors to the church opened to a clear and cool winter day. 100 or so people slowly filed into the street. The snow that had fallen a few days earlier was now a dark slush shoveled against the sides of the road. All of the attendees loaded into their vehicles and set off for the reception hall 10 minutes away. Each driver put on hazard lights as the slow convoy snaked its way to southeast Baltimore. 2 of the vehicles, the ones carrying the 8 members of the wedding party, decided to break from the pack and take a quick detour to a 7-Eleven on the Alameda, a main artery in Baltimore City. They wanted to grab a few sodas and some bags of chips before the reception, just in case it took a while for the food to show up after they arrived. A block away from the store, an unmarked police car pulled up behind the vehicles, red and blue lights flashing. The same car had been sitting outside the church, its occupants observing the celebratory congregants as they walked out. The wedding party pulled over. Door slammed and 3 policemen leaped out of the car and walked up to the wedding party's vehicles. They forced all 8 of the passengers from the vehicles and ordered them to sit on the curb at the traffic island that split Alameda. The men, wearing their white tuxedos, and the women, wearing silky silver, spaghetti-strapped dresses, complained about having to sit on the slushy curb in their wedding outfits. They were told that they would have to sit down or be arrested. And then one of the officers addressed the group. "Y'all know there is a reward for Tony and Wes if you just tell us where they are. It's a lot of money. You sure you don't need that money? This would be much easier on you if you would just say where those 2 are." The 8 sat silently, shivering in their now soaked clothes, while the police continued to grill them. It had been more than 30 minutes since they were pulled over. No information had been collected, not a single idea about the whereabouts of Wes and Tony had been divulged. The wedding party simply sat on the ground, late for the reception, and by now tremendously agitated. The police, circling the party, felt much the same way. Finally, the officers ordered them back into their cars, but not before placing handcuffs on one of the drivers because he didn't have the proper registration for the rental car they were driving. The rest of the wedding party yelled at the officers as they placed their friend in the back of the cruiser. The arresting officer simply looked back at the group and said, "Enjoy the reception. I hope y'all remember where Tony Moore and Wes Moore are. Quickly." Wes was walking down a street, a Philly cheesesteak in one hand and a new pair of blue jeans in the other. His brother was by his side. 30 feet away, at the corner, he noticed a police cruiser. As he got closer, he noticed that the engine was running, and that the two cops inside were murmuring into their walkie-talkies. This was the same squad car Wes had noticed twice earlier in the day, in different parts of the city, but always within 50 feet of where he and Tony stood. But no one had made a move for them, so Wes had chalked it up as simple coincidence. He and Tony continued to move through the crowded Germantown streets toward his uncle's house in North Philadelphia. The crime-ridden neighborhood was where Tony and Wes had escaped just days after the murder. North Philadelphia reminded Wes of the Baltimore neighborhood he had just left. The check-cashing stores instead of banks, the rows of beauty salons, liquor stores, laundromats, funeral homes, and their graffiti-laced walls were the universal streetscape of poverty. The hood was the hood, no matter what city you were in. But just blocks away from their uncle's house, scattered evidence of gentrification, driven by the looming presence of Temple University, had started to manifest. Their uncle's block, where half of the homes sat abandoned and burnt out, represented what the neighborhood had become. Blocks away, where newly built mixed-income homes sat next to picturesque buildings like the Gothic Church of the Advocate, built in 1887, was the direction the neighborhood wanted to go. But even that dynamic wasn't unique. The same thing was happening in Wes's neighborhood, where Hopkins was the driving force of change, aimed at improving the quality of life for students and faculty. Wes wondered where people like him were supposed to go once they'd been priced out of the old neighborhoods, once the land changed hands right under their feet. When they got back to the house, Wes went upstairs to the room that housed the bunk bed he and Tony shared. Tupac's Keep Your Head Up was on the radio, and Wes turned it up. It was one of his favorites. Pac's voice defiant over the melancholy chorus, sampled. Wes sat down on his bed and opened the plastic bag that held his cheesesteak. The grease leaked from the packaging, and the aroma of the cheese whiz and grilled onions rose from a puncture in the aluminum foil. Wes had just raised the sandwich to his mouth when Tony walked into the room. "I gotta run out for a second. I'll be back." Wes just nodded, distracted by the cheesesteak. Under the beats from the radio, he could hear Tony's white Air Jordans pounding down the stairs. It was mid-afternoon, so most of the lights in the house were off. The room was filled with shadows and the soft glow of natural sunlight. Wes heard Tony yell back up the stairs, "I'll be back, yo!" and then the sound of the front door creaking open. His uncle was always telling them to close the door behind them to keep the cold air outside and the warm air inside. When Wes didn't hear the door close behind Tony, he took one final bite and ran down the stairs to slam it shut. As Wes hit the final stair, he looked up and saw his brother lying face down on the floor, a police officer's knee in his back, handcuffs being tightened around his wrist. Before Wes could even react, a half-dozen plainclothes officers were on top of him, the barrels of their guns trained on his head, and the light from their flashlights blinding him. "Don't move! Get your hands in the air!" The officers were now screaming orders to the Moore brothers, telling them to get on the ground and keep their mouths shut. A task force of over 24 Philadelphia police officers, Baltimore City and County police officers, and ATF and FBI officials flooded their uncle's narrow 3-story row house. Within minutes of receiving word that the Moore brothers were back in the house, police had cordoned off the entire block. Outside the cordon, curious onlookers were kept away by Philadelphia police officers as Wes and Tony were led outside in handcuffs and thrown into the back of a police wagon. The 12-day manhunt was over. Word spread quickly through the Baltimore City and County police departments about the arrest. On the dispatch, a message scrolled across the top of the message board. 02-19-2000. Dundalk Dispatch advised that both of the Moore brothers are under arrest in Philadelphia. Cheering responses flowed in. Their colleague had been killed just days earlier. They now believed that the 4 people responsible were in their custody. The newspapers and television networks ran nonstop coverage of the arrest. Civic leaders held press conferences praising the work of the police officers. The county executive of Baltimore County helped lead a telethon that raised money for the widow of Sergeant Prothero and his children. As word spread, a collective sigh of relief seeped through Baltimore's brisk winter air. At home, Mary wept. Wes sat still on the ancient wooden chair. His fingers were intertwined, resting on the table in front of him. His nervousness had subsided months earlier. He knew he no longer had control over his destiny. A year had passed since the Prothero shooting, and Wes was the fourth and final defendant to find out his verdict. It had also been a year since the governor of Pennsylvania had agreed to extradite Wes to his home state of Maryland to await trial. Wes now sat waiting to find out how the jury of his peers had ruled. The foreman stood up, looked briefly at Wes, and then his eyes darted over to the people in the viewing area of the courtroom. Tony and the other two defendants had all been found guilty and sentenced to life in prison without parole. Tony was charged as the shooter and had avoided a possible death sentence by pleading guilty to felony murders. Unlike the other three defendants, Wes had decided to take his case to trial. He insisted that he was not there the day of the murder. 25 witnesses were called. 60 exhibits were displayed. Store security videotapes were shown, and photos were employed by both sides. Wes's lawyer pleaded that the biggest mistake his client made was going to Philadelphia with his brother. His lawyer argued that when Wes was questioned by Baltimore police the day after the crime, before he was announced as a suspect, he was calm, a clear sign of his innocence. His lawyer claimed the police were harassing people in the neighborhood, trying to drum up shaky evidence and confessions. He also pointed out that Wes had converted to Islam in jail and was a father of 4 children whom he talked to almost every day on the telephone from jail. The prosecution cast suspicions on Wes's argument that he'd taken the trip to Philadelphia without asking his brother what he was on the run for. A saleswoman at the jewelry store testified that she recognized Wes as one of the 4 men who'd robbed the store. Also, a necklace was found at the scene of the crime that had Wes's DNA on it. The prosecution claimed it was the calling card they were looking for to prove Wes was there. Wes's attorney argued that Tony must have borrowed the necklace earlier and it had accidentally dropped out of his pocket at the store. There's only one explanation: it came out of the pocket. It came out of the pocket of that jacket, Wes's lawyer proclaimed. Wes was moments away from finding out which story the jury would believe. "Please rise," the bailiff requested. Instructions were ordered. Wes peered over at the jury, 6 men and 6 women. They had deliberated for 3 hours. He looked at each of their faces in turn. No one looked back at him. He felt very alone. He sighed deeply. Sudden apathy sapped him. He knew what the foreman had to say before he even parted his lips. Wes stared straight ahead. He was as still as a soldier on parade awaiting his next command. As he heard the foreman begin, he closed his eyes and leaned his head back. "On the charge of first-degree felony murder, the jury finds the defendant guilty." Wes stood quietly, his face set, as the foreman read out 10 other charges, all with the same verdict. Wes's consciousness left the scene. He had spent the past year sitting in a cell waiting for this day. With the knowledge of the sentences his brother and the other 2 defendants had received, he'd known his fate would be the same. He would spend the rest of his life in prison. The widow of Sergeant Prothero hugged her father and sobbed. She had sat in the pews of different courtrooms for months, and the emotion of watching the sentencing of the final defendant and the slaying of her husband was overwhelming. About 10 feet away, Wes's mother, Aunt Nicey, and Alicia sat stunned with tears in their eyes as well. A large guard made his way over to Wes, who slowly put his hands behind his back. He kept his head and eyes fixed on the front of the courtroom, never once looking behind him to see the family of the police officer, or even his own family. He winced as the cuffs closed around his wrist and the officer began to walk him out of the room. It would be over a month before Wes was in a courtroom again. On that day, he would stand before a judge and hear his fate. "You committed an act like something out of the Wild West, and you didn't even realize how outrageous it was," the judge said. "That makes you a very dangerous person." The sentence was indeed life in prison, without the possibility of parole. The guards placed their hands on Wes and shuffled him away. The hands of the state would stay on him for the rest of his life. Wes had spent much of his adolescence incarcerated, and he knew that occasional bids in the pen were part of the game. But he'd never figured this. Maybe it was because he'd never thought long-term about his life at all. Early losses condition you to believe that short-term plans are always smarter. Now Wes's mind wandered to the long term for the first time. Finally, he could see.